It began with a sealed document no one was supposed to see, quietly circulated then swiftly buried within palace corridors. But when Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged from that private briefing beside Prince William, her expression told a different story. This wasn't routine. This was damage control. And at the center of it all was a name, one tied to Prince Harry, that had suddenly become too dangerous to keep. What unfolded next did not happen in public view, nor was it ever meant to. Reports suggest the document surfaced within a tightly controlled administrative channel, the kind reserved for internal corrections, legal clarifications, and the quiet maintenance of royal continuity. But this was no routine correction. Insiders whisper that the wording inside that document triggered immediate concern, phrases that hinted at inconsistencies, references that did not align, and a designation that should never have been exposed outside its original context. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of palace administration that the moment this leak was identified, an emergency response was initiated, bypassing standard protocol entirely. Different interpretations of that emergency meeting describe a tense and unusually urgent atmosphere. William, known for his measured composure, reportedly moved with rare decisiveness, while Catherine, typically the embodiment of calm restraint, was seen absorbing information that seemed to shift the ground beneath her. Those familiar with the inner workings of Kensington Palace suggest that registry officials were immediately instructed to conduct a full review of sensitive naming records, a process that is typically slow, methodical, and discreet. But this time there was nothing slow about it. The directive was clear: act quickly, verify everything, and above all, contain the situation before it spread beyond internal control. Palace administrative streams, ranging from treasury whispers to security log leaks, began to reflect an unusual tightening of communication. Staff access levels were quietly adjusted. Internal messages became shorter, more guarded. Conversations that would normally unfold across departments were suddenly confined to a select few. It was, as one insider described, a silence that felt deliberate, almost enforced. And then came the moment that confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. Catherine, leaving the office wing of Kensington Palace, appeared visibly shaken. Not dramatically, not openly, but enough for those watching closely to recognize that something had shifted in a way that could not easily be undone. By that evening, the tension had not eased. If anything, it had deepened. Observers noted William maintaining a protective presence, his focus split between the demands of the unfolding situation and the need to steady the environment around him. There were no statements, no clarifications, no attempts to guide the narrative. Instead, there was only silence, thick, deliberate, and telling. And within that silence, one detail continued to surface again and again, a namesake designation linked, however indirectly, to Harry. Not a headline title, not a public honor, but something embedded deeper within the system, something symbolic, recorded, and now suddenly under scrutiny. Why this designation mattered so urgently remains a question layered with speculation. Some suggest it carried historical weight, tied to legacy and memory. Others believe it intersected with legal frameworks in ways that could not be ignored once exposed. What is clear is that the leak did not simply reveal information. It forced a decision. And in a monarchy built on continuity, where even the smallest alteration carries meaning, that decision was never going to be taken lightly. The urgency, the secrecy, the visible strain, it all pointed to a single conclusion: this was not just about correcting a record. It was about redefining something that had quietly existed until it became impossible to ignore. But what seemed like a bureaucratic adjustment quickly revealed itself as something far more personal and far more deliberate. Long before it became a liability, the name in question carried deep emotional weight, a quiet tribute embedded within royal tradition. It was never meant to spark controversy. Yet in a monarchy where symbolism is power, even a single name can shake narratives, alliances, and legacies. Within the House of Windsor, names are never chosen lightly. They are not simply identifiers, they are vessels of memory, continuity, and obligation. Reports suggest that every designation recorded within royal registries, whether tied to titles, honors, or internal acknowledgments, carries layers of meaning that stretch far beyond the present moment. These names echo through generations, binding the living to those who came before, reinforcing a lineage that is as much about duty as it is about identity. And in this carefully maintained system, even the quietest inclusion can hold immense weight. The namesake now under scrutiny did not emerge by accident. Insiders whisper that it was originally entered into the registry as a form of symbolic continuity, a gesture that linked Prince Harry to a deeper thread within the royal narrative. It was not a public-facing title, nor something intended for ceremony or recognition. Instead, it existed within the internal architecture of the monarchy, recorded, preserved, and largely unseen. Those familiar with these processes describe such entries as institutional memory markers, subtle acknowledgments that honor connection without inviting attention. But that quiet existence is precisely what made it so powerful. In a system governed by tradition, where even minor adjustments are weighed against centuries of precedent, the presence of a namesake is never neutral. It signals belonging. It suggests recognition. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforces a bond that, once established, is rarely undone. Different interpretations of royal protocol emphasize that altering such a designation is not just uncommon. It is almost unthinkable. Because to remove a name is to disrupt a thread in the fabric of continuity itself. That is why the preservation of these records is treated with such care. Palace administrative structures are designed to safeguard them, ensuring that every entry remains intact unless there is overwhelming reason to intervene. Legal frameworks, historical precedent, and internal review mechanisms all exist to prevent sudden or unnecessary changes. Nothing is done lightly. Nothing is done quickly. And yet, beneath that rigidity lies something more human, an emotional undercurrent that cannot be ignored. Because names, especially within a family as scrutinized as this one, are not just about tradition. They are about relationships, loyalties, and the quiet acknowledgement of place within a larger whole. To carry a namesake within the royal system is to be remembered, to be anchored, to remain part of something enduring. And to lose it is to feel that connection shift in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. This is where the weight of the situation begins to reveal itself. Because if such a designation, one rooted in memory and preserved through protocol, was suddenly called into question, then something extraordinary must have occurred. Something that outweighed tradition. Something that forced the monarchy to consider breaking from its own deeply held practices. And in a system built on stability, that kind of shift does not happen without consequence. But what turned this quiet tribute into a crisis wasn't history. It was what had just been exposed. The leak didn't arrive with headlines. It slipped through quietly, buried in legal phrasing and internal documentation. But those who read it understood immediately. Something had gone wrong. Something that forced the palace to act before the public ever knew. At first, it appeared insignificant, just another internal record circulating through the tightly controlled administrative system that governs royal protocol. But reports suggest that the language embedded within that document carried inconsistencies too precise to ignore. Dates that didn't align. References that suggested duplication or reinterpretation. And most critically, a namesake designation connected, however subtly, to Prince Harry that appeared to have been used or positioned in a way that stretched beyond its original intent. It was not the presence of the name that alarmed insiders. It was how it seemed to function within the document itself. Those familiar with palace record systems describe a structure built on precision, where even minor deviations are flagged, reviewed, and corrected with quiet efficiency. But this was different. Insiders whisper that the moment the irregularity was identified, the tone shifted from routine oversight to urgent containment. The document, once flagged, was reportedly restricted almost immediately, its circulation halted, its access limited to a narrow circle of senior advisors and legal overseers. What had begun as a technical review was rapidly escalating into something far more sensitive. Different interpretations of the leak suggest that the implications extended beyond administrative error. Some sources hint at the possibility of unauthorized interpretation, where a symbolic designation may have been referenced in a context that carried unintended weight. Others point to the risk of external exposure, where such a detail, if misunderstood or misrepresented, could trigger broader questions about legitimacy, recognition, or institutional boundaries. And in a monarchy where perception is as critical as reality, even the suggestion of ambiguity can become dangerous. Palace administrative streams, ranging from internal audit channels to secure communication logs, began reflecting an unusual intensity. Conversations became fragmented. Instructions shortened. The usual clarity of protocol gave way to something more urgent, more guarded. One insider reportedly described the situation as uncontainable, not because the information itself was explosive, but because of what it could become if allowed to spread without control. It was not just about what had been written. It was about how it might be interpreted once outside the protective framework of the palace. Beyond those walls, the first ripples of awareness were already forming. It is now whispered in the highest echelons of royal reporting that senior correspondents had begun to hear fragments of the situation, nothing concrete, nothing publishable, but enough to signal that something unusual was unfolding. The kind of silence that invites questions, the kind of hesitation that precedes a story. And once that threshold is crossed, control becomes infinitely more difficult to maintain. The concern at its core was not just reputational. It was structural. Because if the namesake designation had been used, referenced, or interpreted in a way that conflicted with its intended role, then the integrity of the registry itself could be called into question. And that is not a risk the monarchy can afford to take. The institution relies on the quiet certainty that its internal systems are exact, controlled, and beyond dispute. Any deviation from that perception, however small, carries consequences that extend far beyond a single document. This is why the response, once initiated, moved with such urgency. There was no time for extended deliberation, no space for gradual correction. The situation demanded clarity, precision, and above all, speed. Because every moment the issue remained unresolved increased the possibility of exposure, speculation, and escalation. And in a system built on controlled narrative, losing that control even briefly can reshape the story entirely. And within hours of the leak surfacing, the response was no longer quiet. It was decisive. No announcement, no statement, no acknowledgement, yet somewhere deep within the royal registry, a change was made, swift, surgical, and irreversible. The name was gone. The process itself, according to those familiar with palace administrative systems, did not resemble the chaos unfolding around it. On the surface, it was controlled, methodical, almost routine. But beneath that calm exterior, the urgency remained unmistakable. Reports suggest that once the leak had been verified and its implications understood, the directive moved quickly through the necessary channels. Legal advisors, registry custodians, and senior oversight figures, each step executed with precision. There were no delays, no extended consultations. The decision had already been made. What followed was the enforcement of that decision in its most exact form. Within this system, removing a designation, especially one tied to something as sensitive as a namesake, is not as simple as deletion. It requires formal classification. Internal language becomes critical. Insiders whisper that the action was framed not as a removal, but as a correction, a subtle yet powerful distinction that allows the institution to maintain continuity while adjusting its records. Others suggest the term compliance measure may have been used, signaling that the change was not optional but necessary to align with established protocols. Every word matters in these documents, and every word is chosen to protect the integrity of the system itself. The timing of the change only adds to its significance. Different interpretations of the sequence suggest that the update occurred within hours, perhaps even less, of the leak being fully assessed. That kind of speed is rare in an institution known for its deliberate pace. It signals not only urgency, but clarity. There was no hesitation, no visible internal conflict that slowed the process. Once the decision was triggered, it moved forward with a kind of quiet inevitability, as though the mechanism for such a response had always been in place, waiting for the moment it might be needed. At the center of this process were Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, figures who, according to sources close to the situation, played a decisive role in ensuring the Directive W. as carried out. Their involvement was not public, nor was it ever likely to be. But within the internal structure of the monarchy, their positions carry authority, particularly when the matter intersects with both legal precision and symbolic consequence. Those familiar with the duchy's operational standards suggest that William's approach would have prioritized institutional stability, while Catherine's presence reinforced the gravity of the moment, anchoring the decision in both duty and awareness of its broader implications. And yet, for all its precision, the action did not bring closure. Because while the name was removed from the registry, the silence surrounding that removal began to grow louder. There was no explanation offered, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. To the outside world, nothing had happened. But within the network of observers, analysts, and those attuned to the subtle shifts of royal protocol, the absence itself became a signal. Questions emerged, quietly at first, then with increasing intensity. Why now? What had forced such a rare action? And perhaps most importantly, what did it mean for the relationship between the institution and the individual whose name had just been erased? Because in a system built on permanence, where records are meant to endure, the act of removal carries weight that cannot easily be dismissed. It suggests not just adjustment, but recalibration. Not just correction, but consequence. And as speculation began to fill the space left by silence, it became clear that the decision, however controlled, had already begun to ripple outward in ways that could not be fully contained. But removing the name didn't erase the implications. It only intensified them. Inside palace walls, the silence was louder than any statement. Staff moved carefully. Conversation stopped when doors opened. And at the center of it all was a growing realization. This wasn't just administrative. It was personal. What had begun as a contained internal correction was now echoing through every level of the institution. Reports suggest that even the most experienced aides, those accustomed to crisis management and discreet recalibration, found themselves unsettled by the speed and finality of what had taken place. There was no gradual adjustment period, no quiet briefing to ease the transition. Instead, there was a sudden shift. One that left people recalculating their understanding of where boundaries now stood. Palace insiders whisper that staff interactions became noticeably restrained, as if everyone was aware that they were operating within a moment that would later be understood differently than it felt in real time. Within advisory circles, the tone grew heavier. Different interpretations of internal discussions describe a tension not rooted in confusion, but in consequence. Because this was not simply about a registry entry. It was about what that entry represented and what its removal now implied. Some advisors reportedly viewed the decision as necessary, a firm step to preserve institutional clarity. Others, however, are said to have recognized the emotional cost embedded within that choice, particularly given its connection to Prince Harry. Even without public acknowledgement, the personal dimension could not be ignored. That personal dimension began to ripple outward, most visibly within the immediate circle of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. William, according to those familiar with his approach, maintained a firm adherence to duty, reinforcing the idea that decisions of this magnitude must ultimately serve the stability of the institution. And yet, beneath that firmness, there were indications of conflict, not hesitation in action, but weight in its aftermath. Because when decisions intersect with family, even the most resolute stance carries an emotional undercurrent that cannot be fully suppressed. Catherine's presence, in contrast, became something quieter but equally significant. Observers within the palace suggest she played a stabilizing role, maintaining composure while absorbing the emotional gravity of the situation. But that composure did not suggest detachment. On the contrary, it seemed to reflect an awareness of what had been lost, not just in procedural terms, but in the more intangible sense of connection and continuity. She stood at the intersection of tradition and empathy, embodying the balance the monarchy continually strives to maintain, even when that balance becomes difficult to sustain. Beyond those walls, speculation began to grow about how Harry himself might interpret the situation. Without direct communication, without public context, the removal of a namesake could carry meanings that extend far beyond its technical justification. Some insiders suggest that the lack of explanation may deepen that ambiguity, leaving space for interpretation that cannot easily be controlled. And in a narrative already shaped by distance and division, even a silent action can speak with unexpected force. At the heart of it all lies a deeper divide, one that has been quietly building over time. On one side stands tradition, with its emphasis on continuity, protocol, and institutional preservation. On the other, the evolving pressures of a modern world where perception, independence, and personal narrative hold increasing influence. This moment, however contained it may appear, seems to sit directly at that intersection. It is not just a decision about a name. It is a reflection of how the monarchy navigates change, how it protects itself, and how it defines the boundaries of belonging. And as that realization settles in, the silence within the palace no longer feels like absence. It feels deliberate. It feels weighted. It feels like something still unfolding even after the decision has been made. In the absence of answers, interpretations filled the void. Some called it protocol, others called it protection, and a few quietly called it something else entirely. As the silence from the palace held firm, the space it created became fertile ground for speculation. Reports suggest that within royal circles, the The decision was framed as a necessary safeguard, an action taken not out of emotion but out of obligation to preserve the internal coherence of the institution. From this perspective, the removal of the namesake linked to Prince Harry was not punitive, but corrective. A recalibration designed to ensure that every designation within the registry aligned precisely with its intended purpose. Nothing more, nothing less. But that explanation, while technically sound, did little to quiet the deeper questions. Because alongside the legal reasoning, there exists a symbolic layer that cannot be ignored. In a monarchy where meaning is often conveyed through what is left unsaid, the removal of a name carries weight far beyond its administrative function. Insiders whisper that such actions are rarely interpreted in isolation. They are read as signals, as reflections of shifting relationships and evolving boundaries. And in this case, the signal felt unmistakable. Whether intended or not, it suggested a redefinition of connection, a narrowing of what had once been preserved. Different interpretations continue to emerge, each shaped by the perspective of those observing it. Some analysts point to the legal framework surrounding royal registries, emphasizing that any inconsistency, no matter how small, must be addressed swiftly to prevent future complications. From this view, the decision was inevitable, triggered by the leak itself rather than the individual it involved. Others, however, focus on the broader narrative, suggesting that the timing and nature of the action reflected a deeper effort to reinforce institutional boundaries at a moment when those boundaries have been increasingly tested. The monarchy, at its core, depends on the perception of stability. It is not enough for the system to function correctly. It must also appear unshakable. And when something disrupts that perception, even briefly, the response must be decisive. This is where the concept of institutional integrity becomes central. Those familiar with the internal philosophy of the Crown often describe it as a structure that cannot afford ambiguity. Every title, every designation, every recorded connection must exist within clearly defined limits. If those limits are blurred, the entire system risks appearing uncertain. And uncertainty, in this context, is not just a weakness. It is a vulnerability. Media narratives have only